And listen, I don't deny that the system currently, it's in peril. And my reason and my appeals often are to the fact that we have parties that are acting in ways that are bringing on a crisis of democratic legitimacy. And they're pursuing, in the case of the Democratic Party, a really risky strategy. And in the case of the Republican Party, a strategy that has essentially given up on the popular vote. And so I think when you have parties acting in this way, my concern also is that you put in place a different institution. What if there's something really organizationally wrong with these parties that they still continue acting irrationally, or they still can't calibrate? And so electoral changes are always risky.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 9th season of the Jonathan Saman Hot Button School Conversation series. I'm Mark Sokol, the president and CEO of JCC Greater Boston, and it's really a thrill to welcome all of you here to join us this evening. The JCC's Jonathan Saman Hot Button School Conversation discussion series invites distinguished figures like those joining us this evening to engage in unique exchanges around controversial subjects. Our panelists are led by an expert moderator through a respectful and thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion about issues of concern to the Jewish community and beyond. And of course, our hallmark as a JCC is civil, respectful dialogue and conversation. We are thrilled to partner with WGBH for tonight's program, examining the Electoral College and whether election reform is needed. Earlier this week, as we all know, the electors in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. gathered to cast the formal votes electing Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Normally, this constitutionally mandated ritual doesn't draw much attention, but it is fair to say nothing about this election has been normal. The spotlight on the 2020 election renewed the questions as to how we elect the president in this country and whether or not change is needed. The current system, of course, allows one candidate to win the popular vote, but another to win the Electoral College and therefore the presidency. We'll examine the roles that race, politics, and geography play in the Electoral College and if reform is needed. Our very distinguished panel tonight, and we're so pleased that they're all able to join us, are here. I'd like to welcome them. First, Amel Ahmed, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, author of the book, Democracy and the Politics of Electoral System Choice. I assume that everybody is now applauding. I can't hear the applause, but I can actually feel them. Let's also welcome Erin Geiger-Smith, who's a freelance journalist and author of the book, Thank You for Voting. And please, once again, a loud round of applause for Erin. Our moderator tonight is Jesse Wegman. Jesse's a member of the New York Times editorial board and author of the book, Let the People Pick the President, The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College. He just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times this week advocating his case for majority rule. As we begin our program, I would like to thank our incredible staff, Amy Eisner and Gavin Andrews, for all the great work that they did in curating and putting this event together, and a huge expression of gratitude to our donors. Without your financial support, we would not be able to produce tonight's program or any of the programs that we have presented over the past 8 years. We appreciate your commitment to fulfilling the mission both of Hot Button School Conversations and of our beloved JCC. And now I am honored to turn this important evening over to our moderator, Jesse Wegman.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to the JCC for hosting this great event. I'll begin by saying this. America had 2 elections for president this year. In one of them, Joe Biden won 7 million more votes than Donald Trump, a margin of nearly 4.5%. That seems like a pretty decisive victory. But of course, the popular vote does not decide the president, the Electoral College does. That election was a nail-biter. Switch just about 50,000 votes across 3 states, and Donald Trump would be the winner. In an election in which nearly 160 million Americans voted, and in which the majority of Americans preferred one candidate, the final outcome turned on fewer votes than it would take to fill Yankee Stadium. By the way, 2020 was almost the exact mirror image of 2016, when Donald Trump also lost the popular vote by millions, but thanks to about 77,000 votes in 3 key states, he won the Electoral College and with it, the White House. In other words, America came as close to President Hillary Clinton as it did to President Trump's second term, even though the difference in the popular vote margin of the 2 elections was 10 million votes. When the machinery of our electoral system produces outcomes this close, and yet at the same time, so far from the popular vote, it's time to stop and take stock. In a system based, at least in theory, on the principles of majority rule and one person, one vote, is this really the best way to elect the nation's leader? I spent the last few years writing a book on this topic, and I discovered that the stories we tell ourselves about the Electoral College, from its origins to its early years to its impact on politics and governance today, are almost all wrong. And that opens the door to debates about changing the system, whether by reforming the college or abolishing it altogether. The other thing I discovered is that there are a lot of extremely smart people who have been thinking and writing about this topic for a long time. And we're so lucky tonight to have 2 of them here representing different professions and different perspectives on the Electoral College. Erin Geiger Smith and Amel Ahmed, thank you so much for being here tonight. I want to start, as Mark did, with the events of this week, which is somehow only half over. On Monday, just 2 days ago, we watched the Electoral College carry out its quadrennial constitutional duty of choosing the president. Usually this is a formality, but this year, the news media, my publication included, treated it like the 7th game of the World Series. And that's because we all know of an unprecedented attack on the process by the president himself and his allies, who continue to insist, despite the lack of any evidence that would be accepted in a court of law, that he in fact won the popular vote in key states and is the rightful victor. Of course, he did not win those states, and Joe Biden is going to be the next president, but Mr. Trump has been able to drag out for weeks an election in which 7 million more Americans voted for his opponent. He will continue to drag it out until at least January 6th, 2021, when Congress officially receives the state's electoral votes. Call me crazy, but something seems messed up about this system. Erin, I'd like you to start us off. Is this the best way to run an election for president?
Well, in my opinion, it isn't. I mean, I am one of those who has come sort of an evolution of thought, as they say, where I spent a long time really thinking the Electoral College is what we have. We've had it since, nearly the start, and it's probably going to be really hard to change. So let's just figure out the best way to live under the system and learn as much about it as we can. But the more I think about it and the more I learned about its history and its present state, I just can't get past the simple idea that it's not a way to run a democracy. We're leaving too many votes uncounted. And by uncounted, I mean people really feeling like they simply don't count. If you're a Democrat in Texas or a Republican in California, too bad. And my also greater concern as I wrote my book, which focuses so much on voter turnout and how to increase voter turnout, make it easier to vote, I struggled more and more with the fact that we put so much focus on the presidential race and thus the Electoral College that it hurts overall turnout in states. And that has a massive effect on down ballot races, which we don't focus on enough as it is. And so that almost is where my greatest concern is now. Not only does it not represent really what the people want, it hurts all of our other offices as well and hurts democracy, I think.
Thanks. That's a great reminder that this discussion is never only about the presidency, although that's the big ticket item. It's about the entire structure of American politics and governance. Professor Ahmed, you've been a defender of the Electoral College's role in the American political system after seeing what happened in the elections of 2016 and 2020. Do you still feel that way?
So I guess in my ongoing bid to be the least popular person at any future dinner party, I continue to defend the electoral. I offer a qualified defense. I would not say it's an overall defense. It's more of a not so fast than a defense. And let's take a look and figure out what's actually happening. As an electoral system, just in general, I think it is not a perfect system. I think it certainly has its flawed. I don't buy into the idea that there's any genius behind it. I think we stumbled into this system and it's stuck around, as do many institutions. They take on different forms and different purposes over time. And I think that's been the case with the Electoral College as well. Looking at the situation right now, I think it's always important to separate out the issue of the potential of faithless electors and independent actions of electors that are designated to vote in a certain way from the operation of the institution in terms of how it aggregates votes, how it distributes electoral college votes. So separating these things out, I'd say the issue of faithless electors is a bit of a sideshow. It's gotten a lot of attention recently, but it's not the norm. The norm is really for electors to be faithful to the choice of their party and their state. And a lot of states have put in place legislation that requires them to do so, and it's within their power to do so. So I think the real issue is the way the Electoral College, first of all, it aggregates votes. It aggregates votes at the level of states, and that's how the Electoral College votes are then distributed. And that's what produces the possibility of discrepancies with the popular vote. That's what can potentially produce disproportionality in terms of the outcome. So I think the principle that I keep going back to, just you've already brought up the principle of majority rule and one person, one vote. And these are all democratic principles that we value. But I think the principle that often gets lost when we're talking about the Electoral College is the need for consensus building within democracy. And I think that's one that I have tried to emphasize because it gets lost in the shuffle. It's easy to understand majority rule and one person, one vote. It's maybe less tangible to understand consensus building, but it's something that we think about a lot when we're designing institutions for the executive especially, or when we're thinking about institutional design. I don't design institutions, but when we're thinking about how institutional design works, I think what's really difficult about the executive is that it's one seat. And when you have just one seat to represent an entire country, it's very difficult. Well, you can't have a proportional outcome, first of all. I think there's always disproportionality, even if you have a majoritarian outcome. So even if you have a majority winner, someone wins 51% of the votes, they're still going to get 100% of the seats. So there is an instinct to try to move beyond just even majority rule to see if there's a mechanism that can try to build consensus among different interests so that it's not a runaway victory for one group or another. And the Electoral College, in my mind, still does that. It does it clumsily, but most executive offices in most established democracies, emerging democracies, try to incorporate a consensus building mechanism like this. And so that's where my kind of hesitation comes when people criticize the work of the Electoral College.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you are emphasizing this point of consensus and also the issue of proportionality that you brought up in these winner-take-all elections. And I want to get back to, I definitely we're going to return to both of those points. I'm also grateful that you pointed out the sideshow of the faithless elector, which I think, people have gotten really wrapped up in this, in no small part, thanks to the Supreme Court taking a case on the issue just in the last term and deciding it. But of course, that decision was unanimous, and it was unanimous for a reason. Faithless electors really are not, although despite the kind of, cool sounding name, are actually very much the exception and really have no impact on the outcome of Electoral College votes. So, and there were none this year at all after there being an unprecedented number in 2016. So I do want to return to those points, but I'm going to start. Let's go back to first principles here, and I'll return to Erin for the moment. Erin, in your chapter of your book on the Electoral College, you remind people that when we go to the polls in a presidential election, we aren't voting for the candidate. We're telling the Electoral College what we want them to do. This is true, of course, and yet it is the opposite of the system that the founders told us that they had designed, which was supposedly based on the premise that electors would be this group of educated, deliberative, independent-minded men who would decide for themselves who was the fittest person to lead the country. So can you tell us first exactly, just remind everyone, what is the college? What is this body that just elected the next president? Why do we have it? And did it ever function as the founders intended it to?
Right. Well, one of the things that I find most interesting about it is both the idea from the start was a sort of had to be a highbrow, lowbrow sort of thought, which is that it was partly needed for practical reasons of there wasn't a way for candidates to travel everywhere easily. Everyone couldn't get to know the candidates. There wasn't the broad media where you can know way more than you ever wanted to know on a minute by minute basis like we have now. So it was practical. They needed a way to gather and send your people forward representing your people at home. And then it was, as you pointed out, when Alexander Hamilton wrote about it, it was going to be this collection of ideas. It would save the country from electing someone who was just popular but didn't have the skills to be president. And then, of course, its legacy is also in slavery, to pacify southern states that had a smaller voting population. And they couldn't, it was, as Amel mentioned, it was this idea that they kind of threw together and pieced together because they didn't have a really great way to elect this executive. And, it was kind of a mess in the early days, but came to be, as you say, really a mirror of the electorate. It just, we go and tell the electors what to do by our vote, and they do it. Like you said, faithless electors are a sideshow, more or less. There are usually a couple, but it doesn't really impact anything. And so it has the practical purpose for which it was theoretically invented really doesn't match what it does today. And so that's kind of how we have to think about it. It's hard for whatever, the way I kind of came to it, described in the book, is for whatever reason it was created, it doesn't really last now. If you want to defend it now, you kind of have to have a different basis than what it was originally for.
And a major reason that the college doesn't operate today, or has never really operated the way that the founders intended, was that something happened in the first decade after the ratification of the Constitution, which they were not anticipating, which was the rise of national political parties. Professor Ahmed, can you talk about how that development, which is not accounted for at all in the Constitution, affected the functioning and our expectations of the Electoral College in the years since?
So a lot of the focus of my research on the Electoral College has actually focused on how the parties are interacting with it. And it's true, the founders never anticipated, or they didn't ever, it's not that they never anticipated, but they frowned on parties, they discouraged parties. The word party itself comes from the Latin partire, which is to divide and create factions. And it was a very kind of pejorative understanding of how to organize politics. So that was their expectation. That's what they went into it with. But in the period since, obviously there have been a lot of developments along party lines. And what we also know is that modern democracies can't actually function without parties organizing interests, and at least mass participatory democracies can't function in this way. And so a lot of my focus has actually been on how parties are interacting with the Electoral College. So I think in terms of trying to understand these discrepancies that are happening. The first question, the discrepancies between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. The first question I always ask is why? And I'm surprised, honestly, that people don't ask that more often. Why are these discrepancies happening? Why do they seem to be happening more frequently? Why don't they happen all the time? So just lots of why questions to try to understand what it is that's happening now. And the fact is the institution itself has not changed, but these close margins that you're describing, Jesse, these close calls and not so close calls, the discrepancies have happened twice in the last 6 presidential elections. So there's clearly something going on. And my focus has been on understanding how the actors are interacting with the institution. And what I found is that there's been a dramatic shift in party strategy starting around 2000 that's really pushing these popular vote distortions in ways that we've never seen before. And so, there's a temptation to think that there's been continuity across time with the Electoral College, but it's really an institution that operates as a vehicle for different actors' aspirations and their strategies. And when party strategies start to veer in these directions, and what I've noticed primarily is a combination of a narrowing towards the base. Parties are very, very heavily focused on the base of their electorate. And that might seem intuitive. Of course, they're going to target their own base to try to mobilize voters, but it's happened much more dramatically since 2000. If you don't mind, perhaps we can put up the chart on party contact. So one of the things that I've looked at, for example, is who's getting contacted by parties. And I've noticed that that's actually changed a lot since 2000. And what happened in 2000 is a shift in technology that's allowing for the micro-targeting of electors. Basically, parties and candidates have a lot more information at their disposal. They can get lots of information on their voters. They know, who to contact, they know what doors to knock on, et cetera. And so what this is data from the American National Election Study that shows us in 2000, respondents who identify as strong Democrats, who we would consider to be the base of the party, were contacted by the Democratic Party. 32% reported they were contacted. By 2016, that was 60% of strong Democrats were contacted by the Democratic Party. When you look at independents and Republicans, it's 20% in 2000. That goes down slightly to 16% in 2016. On the Republican side, you're seeing the same narrowing to the base. So those who identify as strong Republican in 2000 report being contacted by the Republican Party 39% of the time, and that goes to 53% by 2016. Also a decrease among independent and Democrat Party identifiers being contacted by the Republican Party. So we have this narrowing to the base. It's being combined with a geographic narrowing. And what these trends are doing is they're pushing parties towards this kind of a disequilibrium where Democrats are really running up tallies in safe states, and that's what's really driving the wasted vote phenomenon. So I'll just step back from the charts and the numbers to say what's important to me in all of this is that the parties aren't victims of these trends. The parties are producing the trends. The parties are driving the trends that are creating the wasted votes, that are pushing popular vote distortions, and this never happened before. And so some might say, well, even more reason. Let's change the institution. Let's get rid of it. This is not working with our modern system. And again, I'd say not so fast, because what the way these parties are behaving is really unhealthy for democracy overall.
Thank you. And let me follow up with you on that point. And I do want to get into the point about geography and the geographic sorting and the urban-rural sorting that has gotten particularly pronounced in recent years. But first, I want to come back to this point you made earlier on this question of consensus. And I would love you to play that out a little bit more. You know, I was talking about, as we've acknowledged, majority rule and the benefits of majority rule. And the idea that in a representative democracy, representation is the key, right? And it's in a self-governing republic, the people need to see that they can elect the leaders that they want, and that those leaders then represent their interest faithfully. That's the only reason the system survives. And I guess I want to ask you, do you think the Electoral College helps or hinders that process of representation? Do you think Americans feel that the system enables them to elect the president they want, and that president then accurately represents them? And how does that play into your concerns about consensus building?
So let me try to break down that. Great question, really important. I would just ask you to take the question of representation and play it out further, because representation is it's a tool to achieve something else. And what democracy needs is compromise. We need to pass policy. We need to pass policy that is not completely alienating for large chunks of the population. So of course, majority rule is ideal, but it's not the only principle that governs our democracy. Minority protections is another principle. Consensus building is another principle that takes that into account. So I think privileging this kind of one-to-one representation, or the representation of individual voters and individual ideas over group interests, I think it has costs. I'm not saying that that's the wrong principle to emphasize. I'm just saying we have to acknowledge that there are trade-offs. So if we're going to, emphasize majority rule above all else, we need to acknowledge that we are going to lose something in terms of consensus building. And it's the kind of consensus building that is required for the kinds of compromises that democracy requires to remain functional. So what I worry about is the kind of polarization that would result from getting rid of the Electoral College. I know it's hard to imagine because we live in incredibly polarized times already. But one of the things that is fighting against that polarization is the institution of the Electoral College, which draws attention to battleground states. And I know that this is something that is heavily criticized, but the fact is battleground states, they're battlegrounds for a reason. It's because they have a lot of heterogeneity, ideological heterogeneity, demographic heterogeneity. They're a mix of different interest groups, economic interests. And so they represent a kind of moderating influence on presidential races that we wouldn't have otherwise. So it's not that I disagree with these concerns about representation so much as I feel the need to say there are other things we need to watch out for.
Thanks. I guess part of my concern about the battleground states, I think I would push back somewhat on the idea that they are proxies for the country, because I think there's research has shown, at least recently, that current battleground states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin are actually not representative of the country. They are older and they are whiter than the country as a whole. So that's a concern. But also, even if they were perfect representations, United States is in miniature. You have this problem that we see where presidential candidates of both parties focus all of their attention and thus all of their kind of policy platforms on the interests of those battleground states. Hence, we talk about fracking for 10 minutes in the presidential debates, which is of interest to voters in Western Pennsylvania, but not about, say, the wildfires that devastated California, where 40 million people live. So I really think that distortion of our representative politics and of our representative governance is a concern. How would you, and Erin, I would want to bring you into this too. What do you think about that critique of the college, and what ways might there be to alleviate it?
Well, I think consensus building is something we certainly need to spend more time thinking about, and it's vitally important at a time when I think our democracy is struggling. So prioritizing that is extremely important, but it does make me think of the states like my home state of Texas that is getting closer and closer to being a swing state. But because the Democratic Party at large has, written it off for many, many years, and it allows Republicans to go further than they would because they know that they have 60% of the state, but not 40, and 40 is such a large and growing chunk. And so I think that in an ideal world without the college, we might have to see discussions from, again, to California and Texas, because they're big, obvious examples right now. We need the Republican candidate to appeal more to more Californians, even though they already appeal to a chunk. And they would have, I feel like policies would have to be a little more compromised if everyone had to speak to everybody. So like, I think your arguments are wonderful. But I just think we need to broaden them out. And because things are so focused on the battleground states, it's the only places where we're getting that sort of work. And that concerns. That's just a big concern.
Professor Ahmed, can you address this too, that issue of the battleground states and the way they just focus on them distorts campaigns and governance?
For sure. I think I'll start off by saying that we're dealing entirely in hypotheticals. So what I say also is it's a hypothetical. We've never had an election in the United States without the Electoral College. So what I would anticipate happening absent the Electoral College is based on, my theoretical knowledge of how institutions operate and how actors operate. So that's just kind of a disclaimer to say that, we're really trying to project out. But in terms of this discussion here, I often find there's the assumption that if we got rid of the Electoral College, candidates suddenly are going to go everywhere, and they're going to talk to everyone, and they're going to speak as if America was one continuous body of electors. I just don't believe that's true. I think they may go to different places. I think they probably would go to different places, but they're not going to go everywhere because it's a simple strategic calculation. Resources are limited and parties want to win, which means that there are always going to be electors and ideas and interests that have greater leverage, that are going to get 10 minutes of playtime on debate stages. So we might shift what those topics are. We might shift who the median voter is or who the swing voter is. We might change that with a change of institution, but I don't believe we're going to come up with an institution that really incentivizes candidates to go everywhere when their resources are limited and they're always going to invest where that matters. So if it were, a decision between focusing on the battleground states, even if they're not perfectly representative, I think they're still more representative than what we'd see if we got rid of it and you had, Democrats focused on California and Republicans focused on Texas. I think that would be a much more polarized and a system that would be even less representative of the broader electorate.
It's interesting. In my book, I interviewed campaign managers and field directors from both Republican and Democratic presidential campaigns for the last few decades, and asked them this very question. I said, trying to play out your hypothetical, say, what would you do differently to win the election if you had to win a popular vote rather than the Electoral College? And, almost to a person, they all said they would prefer to run a popular vote election. And they said it was because they felt they could actually speak to the American people and the interest of a majority of the people in a way that they can't do now, right? Where they focus on slivers of voters in the I-4 corridor in Florida, or outside in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, or now in Maricopa County in Arizona, right? These tiny slivers of voters. And I guess I struggle to see, these are people, I ask them this because these are people who do this for a living. And so I figure they're going to be pretty good at, thinking about what it actually would mean to change elections in that way. But I guess I'm struggling to see how it's worse to, yes, I think you're right. It changes what topics we talk about, and other topics will get less attention than they might have. But why is it bad to focus on the topics that are of interest to a majority of Americans? There are political issues that have majority support right now, like, say, common sense gun regulations that never get enacted into law because of this sort of counter-majoritarian structure of our government, both the Senate and the Electoral College. Don't you think it would be better for the country and for democracy to have a system that could vindicate those concerns of a majority?
So just to take a step back to, these journalists who are, I read that in your book and I really appreciated it. A little bit of a lens that I applied to it, though, is that they would not be focusing on this kind of this corridor in Florida, but they would still welcome. It would be much easier for them to just be able to focus on their base more, on their ideological sliver. So they could simplify their messages. Of course, they would welcome it. They could simplify their appeals. And so I'm sure you and Erin are both aware of how campaigns approach these and their voter logs and the amount of information that they have and the algorithms that they run that tell them exactly who their voters are. And so the Electoral College forces them to push up against the easy voters. It forces them out of that slightly. Again, all hypotheticals, and you've spoken to the campaign workers. I have not spoken to them as much, but I do wonder if what they're saying is, yes, this would be terrific because we could focus even more on these easy voters. We could message nationally. We won't have to worry about geography at all, and that will make our job all that much easier. I don't know, but it does. It's a concern of mine. And listen, I don't deny that the system currently it's in peril. And my reason and my appeals often are to the fact that we have parties that are acting in ways that are bringing on a crisis of democratic legitimacy. And they're pursuing, in the case of the Democratic Party, a really risky strategy. And in the case of the Republican Party, a strategy that has essentially given up on the popular vote. And so I think when you have parties acting in this way, my concern also is that you put in place a different institution. What if there's something really organizationally wrong with these parties that they still continue acting irrationally or they still can't calibrate? And so electoral changes are always risky. There's always uncertainty. There's no way to totally anticipate how they're going to operate. And we have an institution that has structured presidential elections for over 200 years and facilitated 44 peaceful transfers of power. So that's a pretty remarkable thing. Democracies the world over struggle to put institutions in place for a decade. And so I really want us to be very sober, and it's not to deny any of these claims towards majoritarianism and representation and the importance of these things. It's just to weigh the different kinds of principles that are really at stake here and the potential costs also.
I want to talk a little bit about this urban-rural divide, which I think everyone who looks at the data can see is growing dramatically as urban areas become increasingly Democratic, rural areas become increasingly Republican. And of course, that translates into disproportionate political power for rural areas because of the design of the Senate and the design of the Electoral College. Erin, in your book, you describe how you live in New York City, the biggest city in the country, but that you come from this small town in Texas. So you have this personal connection to the tension between urban and rural America that defines so much of our politics today. Talk a little bit about how you see that tension playing out in the functioning of the Electoral College. Who benefits the most from this system? Is it the urban areas? Is it the rural areas? Is it both? Is it neither?
Right. It is true. I'm from a town of 6,000 people in Texas. So, part of me, truly still, when there's this discussion of the power that rural areas have in the Electoral College, part of me thinks, thank goodness, they could be lost hugely in the shuffle. But the other part of me thinks, well, Liberty at 6,000 probably shouldn't make a decision for all of Texas either. So I do still, and part of it is optimism in a way, because I do think that if candidates had to address the country as a whole, of course, they would spend more time in Houston than they do in Iowa. But maybe it's not fair right now that they spend all their time in Iowa and none in Houston. There are, in fact, more people that are going to be served in these rural areas, in the urban areas. And the fact that that's lost in the current system is a problem. I do think that the outsized power of some of these states just doesn't, it can lead to, if there's not a matchup in the popular vote in the Electoral College, it can lead to just representation that doesn't fit. I do hope that, because we still have, and it's a whole other discussion whether every state should have 2 senators, but those areas do still get represented. Smaller states have a larger footprint in the Senate, an equal footprint in the Senate, giving them an outsized power for their population size, and the House of Representatives as well. So I think that while the rural urban divide has to be considered, that the presidential race isn't the place to do it. But it is the stark divide between rural and urban areas, and the way that they vote, it continues to be astonishing. And I certainly think a problem that candidates need to address. I just think the Electoral College probably exacerbates that rather than
One statistic I saw that that's a really interesting one. It doesn't quite capture the divide, but the 100 largest cities in the country account for roughly 20% of the population,
Right.
and that population votes of roughly 60-40 for the Democratic candidate. The rural areas of America account for roughly 20% of the population, and that population votes 60-40 roughly for the Republican. So the 100 biggest cities and rural America are almost exactly a wash.
Yeah.
And where the election gets decided is in that middle 60%, which consists of inner ring and outer ring suburbs and exurbs and small towns. And that's where the election is much closer in terms of partisan affiliation, and that's where shifting a few votes here and there can make a real difference. So Professor Ahmed, I'm going to put the same question to you about this urban-rural divide. It's obviously real, it's obviously growing, but how important is it in our understanding of the Electoral College's function and dysfunction?
So I share Erin's concern about this, and I think in general there's been a sharp increase in this divide. We imagine that these things have always been in place, but the research shows us that there actually has been a pretty sharp increase starting also around the year 2000, with people who identify as Democrat residing primarily in urban areas and Republicans primarily. Well, thank you. So this is data from the Pew Research that shows us identification for urban and rural populations. In 2000, 55% of the urban population identified as Democrat and 37% as Republican. 2016, those numbers changed to 62% versus 31%. And then within rural populations, it was almost even in 2000, 43% identifying as Democrat, 46% identifying as Republican. By 2016, it's a pretty dramatic shift, 38% identifying as Democrat, 54% identifying as Republican. So again, this is something that has a tremendous impact on our politics that is fairly recent. And it's something that I've focused on a lot because I think it's one of our biggest pathologies right now. I think I always go back to the party. So I'm a student of party politics. So with this also, I go back to the parties. And what we know is that this isn't really self-sorting. That's not what's happening here. People don't have that much mobility. They're bound to where they live. What I mean is people aren't moving to places based on their political identity. People just don't have those many options for job opportunities or family obligations keep them in places. So what's happening, our parties are shifting their attention in the way that Erin described, where they're either paying attention to some places and not paying attention to others. And I think it's a real danger. It's one of the things that is really fueling the popular vote distortions. And it's something that can be remedied. And one of the things that I found really potentially hopeful in this last election were the openings to shift that geography a little. And we saw it on the Republican side, the opening of certain segments of the Latino population in urban centers showed an opening for Republicans. And then on the Democratic side, you also saw the possibility of shifting the landscape. The campaign of Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, I thought honestly was brilliant, even though he didn't prevail, just challenging this idea that Democrats can't compete in rural areas. And so this is something I fully embrace. And I think, when we talk about institutional reform versus political shifts, institutional reform always seems so much more tangible. And so, my mind, I do get that the institutional reform seems much more tangible, but it's the political reforms, the shifts in strategy and the attempts to remedy these kind of party pathologies that for me would have the biggest impact.
Let's talk about turnout, which is something that Erin brought up a little while ago, and which I think is a really important topic because a disengaged populace is really not a self-governing one, right? It's one that has kind of resigned itself to whoever's in power. They're both bums, they don't care. It's not going to affect their lives. And that's really concerning for the long-term health of any representative democracy. It's clear, I mean, the data are very clear that battleground state turnout is systematically and significantly higher than turnout in the so-called safe states like Massachusetts, like California. And that's for an obvious reason, which is when people know that their vote matters to the outcome, they are more likely to turn out and vote. So it's amazing that people in safe states vote at all, given that they know what the outcome in their state is going to be. But nevertheless, they do. And this year, even in the face of this, devastating pandemic, we saw amazing increase in turnout, I think driven largely by strong feelings, both positive and negative, about the incumbent, Donald Trump. But in the longer term and in the bigger picture, I think, it really is a legitimate concern that turnout is so low in the United States. I mean, even this year, which had record-breaking once in a century turnout, was only 2/3, right? We're well below the norm for, I think, representative democracies elsewhere in the world. Can both of you, I'll start with Erin, sort of address the question of turnout and the Electoral College, and whether that itself is reason enough to at least reform, if not abolish, the system?
Right. Yeah, I think, everyone is cheering this turnout in this last election at about 66%. But really, I mean, it's just not that great. It's certainly better than the 61 that it was in 2016, but it's frankly not good enough. And I don't think we can say the country has spoken when only 66% of people showed up. And especially when you look at how different groups vote, our youngest voters, ages 18 to 29, still only voted about, the numbers are still finalizing, but it's roughly 55%. And that is considered a huge victory for 18 to 29-year-olds. And that, no one should be satisfied with those numbers. So I think
that would be an F.
Yeah, it would just be an F. It would be half, barely half the kids showing up. And the fact that it's a wonderful thing is just kind of a bummer. But I think anything that we can do to raise turnout in this country, especially among younger voters and especially among those who vote disproportionately low, Asian Americans vote usually at low rates. They had a huge surge in this last election. Hispanic Americans, Black Americans still vote at a little lower rate usually than white Americans do. So I think that has to be a huge focus, and anything that hurts turnout, and I think the Electoral College does, really needs to be on the table as far as improvement and discussion. And both data-wise, as you mentioned, there are so many reasons that certain states have a higher turnout, including automatic voter registration laws and same-day registration and just a fostering an environment. But there's no doubt that swing states have higher turnout rates because people feel like there's something at stake. And so, it has to be considered as a way to make things a little better. And, I don't think turnout can be the only reason that we get rid of the Electoral College, obviously, but it's a big deal. And so data-wise, it's there. And then I can just truly say anecdotally that was the number one question I got anytime I talked about this book was, I live in a red state or a blue state, why should I vote? Or my friend lives in a red state or a blue state, why do I vote? It is the top question, especially that young people have. And it's hard. You have to really sell the importance of those down ballot races because, and the idea that if you're in the minority party, you're never going to be the majority party unless you show up and vote, obviously. But, the truth is, you can't tell someone in Oklahoma that's a Democrat that they better show up and cast that ballot for Joe Biden. And it impacts turnout, and we have to think about it.
And the reason we have these red states and blue states, so-called, is because of a feature of the Electoral College, which doesn't get as much attention as it should, which is the statewide winner-take-all law.
Right, absolutely.
And these are the laws that states adopt. This is not in the Constitution. For people who are just sort of learning about how the Electoral College works, this is not what the founders didn't talk about this at the Constitutional Convention. When they saw states begin to adopt this rule of how to award their electors, the winner-take-all laws basically says, what it sounds like, a state awards all of its electors, 100% of its electors, to the candidate who wins the most votes in the state, regardless of how many votes the candidate wins, regardless of how close the margin is. They got 100% of those. The founders who saw these laws taking effect, like James Madison, were pretty upset by them. They saw the distortions that they caused. And Madison himself actually tried to propose a constitutional amendment that would prohibit the use of winner-take-all. He didn't succeed. We still use it today. 48 states out of 50 use it. And it creates this phenomenon of red and blue states where, in fact, millions of Republicans live in blue states, millions of Democrats live in red states, right? All states are actually purple states, but we call them red or blue because of winner take all. And that's what affects turnout, right? When a state is safely red or safely blue, people think that my vote doesn't matter. Whereas in those closely fought swing states, it really does. So Professor Ahmed, I guess I would ask you the same question about the role of turnout and the role of this sort of artificial dichotomizing of the American electorate into red and blue blocks, and how that gets us toward the kind of consensus that you've expressed so well that is important to a democracy.
Yeah, I think turnout is a big concern of mine as well. And if I may just press play on this broken record of mine one more time. So for me, turnout is, and there's a lot of research so that turnout is mostly a function of mobilization. It's a function of where parties choose to mobilize, where they invest their resources. So we think of voting as something that emanates just from our individual decisions, and it does, but really we need a large support structure to translate individual decisions to actually showing up to cast that ballot. And a lot of it has to do with a party's investment in a specific place and in a specific constituency, and whether or not they have get out the vote efforts in place. And what we've seen also is that really has narrowed considerably. So I don't doubt that the Electoral College may provide some kind of disincentive at a local level for individuals. I don't think it's a top factor in voter turnout. And what I would say also is the story with turnout is not a straightforward one. In the last, so again, much of my research starts in 2000 to try to figure out what's been happening in this time period. And turnout has increased dramatically in the United States. What we see is that there's been a 15% increase in turnout between 2000 and 2016. And it's been really uneven. So when we break that down into different categories of urban, rural, different types of constituencies, 5 different categories, the most urban constituencies saw a 34% increase in voter turnout between 2000 and 2016. The most rural constituencies saw a 3% increase in turnout. So there's just something happening with turnout that is not really that straightforward. And again, my mind goes to parties because I know that they have such a strong impact in whether or not people decide to exercise their right to vote. And that influence they have is not properly structured. We don't pay attention to it. There are things like campaign finance reform that have gotten a lot of attention, and efforts to regulate how candidates and parties behave in ways that impact political outcomes. And I think we need to pay a lot more attention to how candidates and parties behave with respect to voter mobilization, voter suppression in some cases. And I really think this is the next big battle. And it's not an institutional fix. It's a really difficult political fix to track what they're doing and how it impacts our political outcomes.
Professor Ahmed, I want to ask you a question. This actually comes from one of the audience members, and it gets back to this question of consensus. This is from Stephen Schulman. How does the Electoral College build consensus? And I think it's a great question because it gets at my concerns about the battleground states being the kind of overbearing focus of the candidates for both parties, and really to the exclusion of everyone else. So how do you see the Electoral College as it functions today with the statewide winner-take-all rule in place as building consensus among all Americans?
So I'll say first, it's not the only kind of consensus building institution we can have. There are other places in the world that, so in France, there's a runoff system that also is a consensus building mechanism. We've heard talk of ranked choice voting as a different kind of consensus. So it's not the only kind of consensus building, but it is a mechanism that requires the candidate to show their winning ability in a lot of different contexts. So can you win in this context, and can you win in that? Can you win in this state, and can you win in that state? So that is, it's a kind of roundabout way of building a consensus in a kind of instantaneous election situation. So we don't have time to necessarily do the work of a runoff that you have in France. In France, you have one kind of like one round of elections, and the top two vote getters then go back and build consensus among other parties to get their support. Here we do it through this, admittedly clumsier mechanism, but I do think of it as establishing the candidate's winning ability in lots of different contexts.
Okay, thanks. There's a question here. I think we want to get to the actual reforms that are possible. I know, Professor Ahmed, you're leery of reforms and the sort of unintended consequences of them, but I think there is always an appetite to talk about them. And so I do want to get to those. But I do want to address one of the questions here, which we touched on very briefly earlier, which is the historical relationship between slavery and the Electoral College. This is a question from Rachel White. And I'm happy to sort of take this on just because I wrote a good deal about it. Unless Erin, if you want to say something about it, or Professor Ahmed.
No, I have. Your book definitely covers that more than mine. So hit it.
I'll start now, and then I think it can open up maybe a slightly broader discussion about race and the Electoral College and race and voting in general. But the sort of quickest sketch I can give of it is basically that the founders, slavery was at the center of all the major compromises at the Constitutional Convention. Of course, we know this from the biggest, one of the biggest compromises that was struck there, which was the 3/5 compromise, and that was the agreement to treat slaves as 3/5 of a white person for the purposes of representation in Congress. And what that ends up doing is giving those southern slaveholding states, which had populations of maybe 40 to 50% of their population were enslaved people, they got extra power in Congress, in the House of Representatives, which was considered the most important branch of government, thanks to their slaves, who of course couldn't vote, who had no human rights at all. And that power translated not just into power in voting for national legislation, it translated into the presidency once the Electoral College was adopted, because the Electoral College, as it is designed in the Constitution, gives states a number of electors that is equal to its representation in Congress, its members of the House and its 2 senators. No. So if a house sorry, I just heard some, sorry. If a state has extra representatives because of their slaves, they have extra power to elect the president. And indeed, we see that for 36 of the first 40 years of the country's history, a Virginia slaveholder is president, right? And that's not a coincidence. The South has outsized political power well into the 19th century. It has a name, they call it the slave power. The northern states are furious about it. And one of the most amazing parts of this story is that after the Civil War and the elimination of slavery, the abolition of the 3/5 clause from the Constitution, you would think, oh, problem solved, right? Now Black people actually count as citizens and they have the right to vote. But in fact, the problem only got worse, because in the aftermath of Reconstruction, with what the southern states called the redemption, they clamped down on Black political participation through poll taxes, literacy tests, outright violence and intimidation at the polls, terrorism, and Black people were basically essentially entirely disenfranchised in the Jim Crow era. It was down in the single digits of participation into the 20th century, and yet they now counted for a full people. So it was like the 5/5 clause. So really up well into the middle of the 20th century and until the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of the mid-1960s, we see the real influence of slavery and racial subjugation playing itself out through the Electoral College and through the way our president gets elected. So millions of Black voters throughout the South were just invisible well into the 20th century. And even today, you can see that echo bouncing around again, because in the South, those states are, Georgia was an exception this year, but all those other Southern states, there's millions of Black people living in them, and yet they never get represented by a single elector, because there is a slight majority of white voters who vote overwhelmingly for the Republican in those states. So we really see the echoes of slavery, which were right there at the founding, affecting our system for electing the president all the way through to today. I'll leave it there, and if Erin or you, Professor Ahmed, want to say anything more about that, I'd love to hear it.
I know. I mean, I think that's right, that the Electoral College kept Black people from counting, as a full person for a long time. And then because of Jim Crow laws and our northern-southern divide, that lasted for a very long time. Not to mention that Reconstruction ended as sort of a compromise after an Electoral College debacle in the 1800s. So I do think we can't have the full discussion without looking at that legacy. I do think, rational minds can disagree on how much the Electoral College has, racist, for lack of a better term, implications today, but it certainly kept us unequal for well longer than we needed to be.
I'll just add to that quickly, because I think I appreciate the history of it. I work in these historical periods, and I'm well aware of the history of the institution. I would just add that just about every single one of our institutions has the same elitist, racist history. That is the reality and the reckoning of our democracy that we all have to come to terms with. And I would, just say the last point Erin made, to put it in different words, we still have to figure out for ourselves whether or not these institutions are monuments or they are living, evolving things. And so when you look today, and it is true that there are states in which the Black vote is underrepresented because of the demographic composition, but then you have other battleground states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and places where, the Black electorate has a lot of voting power. So again, not to suggest that this is not an important consideration, but to weigh all of the different factors and to weigh them soberly in our own context.
Great. I'm going to shift gears just because the questions are coming in, and I would love to get to this point about reform and what we can do, or what people who are interested in changing the system can do. And this question is from Charles Small, which has to do with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. He asks, can you talk about the movement and the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact to avoid the effect of the Electoral College? I don't want to monopolize time here, but I'm happy to describe what this is, since I also have spent a lot of time researching and writing about it. But if either of you wants to take it and explain it, I'm also happy to do that.
I think you are more optimistic than I that it has a good chance of passage. So
well, so here's what I'll say. The compact, this is an agreement among states. Interstate compacts are in effect all over. There's dozens of them, perhaps even hundreds that are currently in effect. They're just agreements among states over water rights, or say a multi-state lottery system or something like that. It's something that states can agree to do without having to go through the federal government. There is an interstate compact that now is in existence. It's been around for about 15 years, called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And states that join this compact commit to, through their own state laws, award their electoral votes differently than they do today. Remember how we talked earlier about the winner-take-all laws that states have adopted? There's purely a state law. There's nothing in the Constitution that says they can't do it or that they have to do it. This compact recognizes that fact, and it takes advantage of it. It says, well, if states can award their electors however they like, why do they have to do it by the state winner-take-all rule? Instead, what states that join this compact agree to do is they agree to award all of their electors not to the winner of their state's vote, but to the winner of the vote in all 50 states combined. And the way that the compact works is, once states representing a majority of electoral votes, 270 electors, which is what you need to win to become president, Once states representing that number join the compact, it takes effect, and automatically the person who gets the most votes in the country wins the presidency. And that solves what I think for many people is the biggest concern about the Electoral College, which is that it can put in the White House the candidate who won fewer votes. And so, I think that is a real legitimacy concern. And I think Professor Ahmed has talked about this as legitimacy is a crucial element of a representative democracy. It is hard to see how a person who wins with fewer votes than his opponent can then win the election. 15 states have so far joined this compact. They represent together 196, 15 states plus DC, I should say. They represent 196 electoral votes together. So you need 74 more to get to 270. There's a few states that are right on the cusp of passing it. And I think, it is, I think Erin is right. It's going to be a heavy lift to get those last 74 electoral votes, but it is by far the furthest advanced effort to reform the Electoral College that we've seen in at least half a century and perhaps in American history. I think it's exciting because it gets us talking about how we reform the system. In this case, you're not actually abolishing the Electoral College, you're using its design in the Constitution to effect a national popular vote. But I'd be interested to hear what both Erin and Professor Ahmed think about this proposal.
I'll be brief because you covered it, but I think it's the best option. I think it's sort of what states could consider the safest option, because you discuss a lot in your book the different merits of if you went to a proportional system versus a winner take all, but it's not going to do anyone any good if 10 states go proportional and everybody else stays the same. I mean, that could lead to even more just chaos. So I think it's the safest method. And, I think anything that gets people talking about this is great, because I think a lot of people don't know that states can award their electors as they please. Maybe people got a little more of an idea of that in the last few weeks, but not under any sort of rational theory. So I think it makes much more sense than any other reforms. And I think the ideal would be a constitutional amendment where Congress and then the states all agreed on something, but that seems especially far-fetched.
Professor Ahmed, do you want to weigh in on this one, or?
I will try to be brief, and I'm not a fan.
You're like asking a member of the jury who has said they won't vote for the death penalty to vote for the death penalty.
Right. Tell us why you like it, though.
No, it's no death. So here's my concern. I have lots of concerns with the compact. I don't think it is likely to move ahead. But my concern is, first of all, is that you're bringing it to a direct popular vote. So that's what the compact comes down to. You now have a direct popular vote with no consensus building mechanism. So there's that. But the other thing that I think hasn't really been discussed or considered is that if you change the rules of the game, you change the entire architecture of the election. It's not as if you're going to rerun to 2016 and have a different outcome. You're going to rerun 2016 and have a completely different election, meaning more people are running more. So once you go to a direct popular vote, you're likely to see more candidates, and they're going to split the vote further. And it's going to be more difficult to get that majoritarian outcome that you're talking about. So I worry that people who are moving ahead haven't done the different possibilities that could happen once you change this kind of architecture.
And certainly, Donald Trump made the point in 2016 when he wasn't arguing that he had actually won the popular vote because of all those millions of illegal votes that he never identified. He was arguing that he would have won the popular vote had the rules been different. And while, I think he's probably wrong about that on the merits, he was certainly entitled to make the argument, because as you say, you change the rules of the game and you change how the game is played. That's certainly true. And so all these sort of switch 50,000 votes or switch 70,000 votes is a little bit of an artifice, right? Where we obviously, if it were a popular vote election, it would be a different election. But let me ask this, and this ties into a question from one of the audience members, Betsy Jacobs asks, do Republicans talk about electoral college reform, or is this strictly a Democratic issue? I certainly have my thoughts on this and my experience, but Professor Ahmed, I'd like you to weigh in because you think in terms of how parties function and how they think about electoral strategy. Can you talk about in your work how you see these two parties approaching the Electoral College and whether they see it as valuable for them to try to advocate for any reforms? And then I have my own stories after that.
I think there's little talk within the Republican Party and little chance that we're going to see any interest within the Republican Party. So on this front, I'm a complete realist. Parties don't forego their partisan interests, no matter what their democratic ideals. We see that on display and on repeat over and over again. So I don't think that's anything we should count on. And at this point, it's really a zero-sum situation. What's going to benefit Democrats is going to hurt Republicans, or at least that's clearly the perception. And with any form of electoral change, electoral reform, you are asking politicians who are elected under one system to choose to change that system for an unknown future. So it's an uphill battle under any circumstances. I think if push comes to shove, I'm not sure that most Democrats would actually go for it because there is such uncertainty. There is a lot more talk in Democratic camps, but it's such a risky proposition. Historically, where we see real electoral change is where you have an exogenous and existential threat to both parties. And that's when it comes in. I don't see that happening right now. And so I don't see the Republicans budging. And I'm not sure when push comes to shove what Democrats would do.
I would add that I think you are talking about lawmakers in particular, and I think you're probably right in that regard. I will say that as long as public polling has existed on the issue, a majority and sometimes an overwhelming majority of Americans have supported a switch to a popular vote. And that polling goes back into the early 20th century. In the late 1960s, it was over 80% of Americans supported a popular vote. This is the story I tell in my book, is that we came closer to abolishing the Electoral College in 1969, 1970 than we ever have in American history. And the story is a fascinating one, and it does illustrate a lot of these cross currents that we've been talking about here of North and South, rural and urban. But one thing it didn't really reflect was a partisan differential, because the parties were right then in the process of sort of that great switch, right, where the Republicans were becoming the party of the white Southerners, and Democrats were absorbing Black voters in the North. But I think you're probably right that right now Republicans don't see any value in trying to change a system that has now given them the White House twice while losing the popular vote in the last 20 years, and nearly did so again this year by a matter of about 50,000 votes. However, I want to push back a little on it, because I think we're not so far as we might think from Republicans suddenly freaking out about this system. And the example that I use, and feel free to challenge me, either of you, on this, is Texas. Because Texas, as Erin said earlier, is definitely moving in a very clear direction. And that direction is toward a more democratic state. It is used to be much deeper red than it is now. There was question about whether it might even flip this year, but it didn't. Donald Trump won it. But the fact that we were even having that conversation, I think, should put fear into the heart of Republicans, because if Republicans can't win Texas in the Electoral College, they have no viable path to the White House through the Electoral College. Texas accounts for more than 10% of the electoral votes that you need to win the presidency. So with that awareness, and I think that the likelihood that Texas becomes a Democratic majority state in the next 5 to 10 years is pretty good. Professor Ahmed and Erin, what do you think? How do you think the parties might react if that were to happen?
I think that is what would have to happen. I think this year, next year, I don't think Republicans have much incentive. But I think when there's a big switch like that, barring there not being some big switch in 3 other states to counter out Texas, but Texas is just heading in that direction. I did not think there was a chance it was going to be blue this time. It's just not that close. But within the demographics are just simply such that within 10 years, if not sooner, if Texans vote, then it's going to be a blue state. I mean, so at that point, when your hand is to the fire, you have different thoughts about, you have different thoughts about things, but it would take that sort of ground shaking, because otherwise, Republicans that control all of Texas currently have zero incentive to give the 45-ish% of Democrats any say in the presidential election, and there's just no incentive. So it would take that, but that's coming.
What do you think, Professor Ahmed?
I think you're absolutely right. And I would add, I said before, what it takes to get this kind of electoral reform is this kind of existential threat to the parties. But also what it takes is high levels of uncertainty. And so the whole purpose of these institutions is that they structure competition in a way that gives people expectations about how things will proceed, ways to strategize. And if suddenly we've got all sorts of uncertainty in these big states, that would likely shift things for Republicans as well. I would add, though, if we are getting to the point where Republicans are losing Texas because they are not competitive in urban areas, then we've got to break down in both parties that, I still think whatever the institutional fix is, the track that these parties are going down is a really dangerous one. And we are in a situation now where for the foreseeable future, I would say Democratic presidential candidates are poised to win the popular vote. If they do not also win the Electoral College vote, we're going to have a discrepancy.
I think that's true, and I'm really concerned about that. I also think it's an argument in favor of a popular vote because, the Senate's inherent bias, which is only getting worse, is, I think, its own problem. But as Erin pointed out earlier, while we may want to, fantasize about changing the Senate, we don't like it. It was a very contingent decision that was made just to keep the convention alive in 1787. It is with us for good. It is effectively unamendable by the Constitution's own terms. If the Senate is going to become increasingly unrepresentative, that is, if I think by one count I saw, by 2040, in 20 years, 70% of Americans are going to be represented by 30 senators and vice versa. 30% of Americans will be represented by 70 senators. I mean, that is a recipe for large-scale systemic breakdown of a representative democracy. Why would, in that situation, assuming we can't change the Senate before then or add states or whatever we might do to balance that out, why not have a popularly elected president so that, as you say, at least then you would be offsetting that bias with another bias, which is, as you say, Democrats probably winning the popular vote for the foreseeable future. Why not do that?
I am not of the position that we have to keep the Electoral College. What I hear in what you're saying and what really gives me the greatest concern is that is a democratic breakdown. And I don't think we realize how significant that would be. If we get to the point where the only way to maintain a democratic legitimacy is to switch to this popular elected executive, there isn't really a democracy in existence that has direct popular election of the executive. We would be the only ones. So, again, treating the symptom and not the underlying pathology, in my mind, would seem to be rewarding this kind of odd behavior that these parties are taking part in that's producing this. And I agree, Jesse, if we are at that point, then that is also a crisis of democratic legitimacy. I think my interest is trying to at least sound the alarm so that maybe we don't get to that point. And I will just say, just very quickly, I don't think my position, it sounds like a conservative position to just keep this institution in place. I don't think of myself as a conservative by any means. And I am interested in radical reforms, but not of this. I am a little bit worried that all of our brilliant activists are so focused on the Electoral College, which honestly, I think the whole Electoral College is kind of a sideshow. And then we're not focused on these other issues that are really affecting voting access and voting mobilization and the general support for the individuals exercising the right to vote.
Can you and Erin, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by those other issues and what they are and what you might do to solve them?
Go ahead.
Sure. So I've been very, very focused on protection of voter information, and this is something that's become a lot more salient lately. Most of the attention, though, is focused on protecting voter information from third-party actors that would engage in a kind of disinformation. I think we need to give a lot more thought on how to protect voter information, even from the parties that are producing the information, and make sure that these parties and candidates are good stewards of these data, which are so powerful. And they can shift elections, just knowing who, the voter information contains voting history, occupation, all sorts of personal information that can really be used to either mobilize or demobilize segments of the electorate. So that's just one area. There's lots that really needs attention on the front of voter mobilization. And I'm sure Erin knows lots about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most thing we need to focus on is education and voter suppression in all of its different forms. I mean, the more that we can get people to vote and learn how to vote, then the more they understand how the Electoral College goes. And, education seems like a solve anyone could say, but we don't do it. I think, to go back to talking about young people, it is those of us who aren't young's fault that young people don't vote, because we don't have a mechanism to teach them about voting, and we don't have a mechanism to teach them about the Electoral College or the danger of a country that is as divided as we are, and how bad it would be if our democracy really becomes even more unrepresentative. And so I do think putting more thought into the parties, putting more thought into how we get people to vote, how people, like, as you're saying, how people are getting people to vote. And then the even more dangerous way, part of me thinks, however you get someone to show up, if they show up, great. But, the continued voter suppression and using that information to do it, purging voter rolls to do it, good old fashioned closing polling places to do it. We really have to focus so much in this next 2-year cycle and 4-year cycle on new laws that are being created to keep people from voting. The voter fraud conversation is going to be used to create new laws that suppress the vote. And my biggest argument is that should not be a partisan issue. We need to somehow shift that lens. But yeah, those are all threats, and the more that we can talk about it and better understand, the better off we'll be. I mean, I too agree that we're not in a good place, and we need to think of all the things that can get us to a better one.
So I think we have time for this one last question, and it's actually a big question, and so I apologize for springing it on you with only a little bit of time. But if you can give us somewhat truncated a response, Professor Ahmed, this is from Jeffrey Kaufman. In any electoral college system, it seems that a third party has virtually no chance. This gets to your point earlier about the winner take all. Would not a third party or even a fourth be beneficial for addressing some of the evils that people perceive with the college? In the multi-state compact system, a third party would seem to have even less chance of having much influence. Your thoughts? Could you, Professor Ahmed, speak about the role of third and fourth and additional parties in a representative democracy like this, and how they might affect our governance?
I think the biggest impediment to a third party is our general electoral institutions, not the Electoral College per se, but winner take all at any level, at the congressional level, at every level of our system. We have winner take all systems, and those systems really don't support more than two parties. It's really just a function of the calculations of political actors going into it. Winning electoral office is really costly compared to lobbying existing organizations or joining those existing organizations. So a system like ours has a real disincentive for third parties. That's not to say we will have the same two parties for eternity. Parties change, but there isn't really an opportunity for third parties in a long-term sense. So that's not the Electoral College per se, but I think it's a feature of our general electoral system.
You want to add anything, Erin, about just the benefits or drawbacks of a multi-party system?
I don't know if the benefits or drawbacks are probably, it's all in theory good to have new ideas in the mix, but if it leads to someone being elected who really had no business being there. But I think it's a very strong argument for ranked choice voting, and to consider allowing you can get those third party ideas in. They may not win, but it can build up and add to the conversation. So, that's the practical answer is look a little harder at ranked choice voting.
And I will say, ranked choice voting deserves its own hour and a half discussion. It's a really interesting reform that's been taking root all over the country. It's about to be instituted in New York City, the biggest jurisdiction yet in the country to adopt it. It is a way, as Erin said, to incorporate more political voices and viewpoints and make people feel that they have more choices without having the spoiler effect that we've seen third parties have in elections. It takes some of the fangs out of the winner take all system that Professor Ahmed is talking about. So with that, I want to say thank you both so much for such a really interesting and wide-ranging and enlightening discussion. It's been great, and I'm proud and happy to be a part of it. And so thanks for including us. And I will turn the mic back over to Mark.
Thank you, Jesse, Amel, Erin. Brilliant, fascinating, informative, thought-provoking, incredible launch to our Hot Button School Conversation series this year. Incredibly timely conversation. I personally learned so much from listening to the three of you. We are so grateful to you. And I want to end by depressing all of you with the following, which is, this is after all a Jewish community center. And just to let you know that Jewish tradition has been wrestling with this issue for, about 2,000 years, and we haven't yet really figured it out. There is a famous story of the rabbi in the minority arguing with the rabbis in the majority, and the minority rabbi even invokes a heavenly voice to convince everyone that his point of view is correct, and the rabbis in the majority say, no, not even God can resolve these arguments. This has to get worked out by us here down on earth. To which God smiles and says, see, my children have actually outdone me. So there are no shortcuts in history to working all this out. But I will say that our children, you wonderfully eloquent, articulate, and brilliant folks have really outdone yourselves and our expectations this evening. So thank you so much for a fascinating and informative evening. We are very, very grateful. Wishing you and your families very happy holidays and a happy and healthy new year, and may 2021 be a hell of a lot better than 2020. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.